66 books, more than 40 different authors, 15 centuries of history, and yet a single story. Pause for a moment and think about that. Shepherds, kings, fishermen, prophets, doctors, and poets, men separated by centuries, cultures, and empires, wrote texts that, when placed side by side, seem to form one continuous narrative. This is not merely impressive, it is unsettling, because the more carefully you read the Bible, the more you begin to notice something most people never see. The details talk to each other. Stories that appear small point toward future events. Symbols appear in one book and resurface centuries later with even deeper meaning. It is as if every page is part of a massive puzzle, and at the center of it there is one person, Jesus. But here is what almost no one realizes. Jesus does not appear only in the New Testament. He is hidden in the shadows of the Old Testament, in stories that seem ordinary, in characters who barely receive attention, in symbols that pass unnoticed. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "The New Testament is hidden in the Old, and the Old is revealed in the New." And when you begin to see this, the Bible stops being just a collection of spiritual stories. It becomes a living narrative, a story carefully constructed over millennia. Now let me ask you a quick question. What is that one Bible story you have heard hundreds of times, but never felt like you truly understood? Maybe it is the story of Adam and Eve, maybe the Red Sea, maybe one of Jesus' parables. Hold that story in your mind for a moment, because today we are going to look at the Bible in a different way, not as isolated stories, but as connected patterns. And the more you begin to notice these patterns, the harder it becomes to ignore something extraordinary. So before we continue, leave a simple comment below. Just write, "The Bible is one story." That small action helps this video reach more people who are also trying to understand the scriptures more deeply. Now take a deep breath, because we are going to begin with a story that almost everyone overlooks. It is in Genesis 24. At first glance, it seems like a secondary episode. A servant looking for a wife for Isaac. Nothing very dramatic. Nothing that seems to change the course of history. But if you slow down, if you pay attention to the details, if you watch where the emotional weight of the story really falls, something strange begins to emerge. The main character does not even have a name. The bride barely speaks. And Isaac, the man for whom the entire mission exists, only appears at the end. And yet the entire chapter vibrates with a quiet tension, as if it is hiding a meaning far greater than it first appears. And when you realize who this servant truly represents, you begin to understand something surprising about how God works behind the scenes of history. And that is where the real mystery begins. The story begins right after one of the most intense moments in the entire biblical narrative. Abraham has just climbed Mount Moriah, prepared to sacrifice his own son. A test of faith so extreme that readers even today pause to reflect on the weight of trusting God. At the last moment, God intervenes. A ram replaces Isaac. The promise continues. But after that dramatic moment, something curious happens. Isaac simply disappears from the narrative for a time. He does not go out searching for his own future. He does not travel to find a wife. He does not build his own story. He simply waits. And in his place, Abraham sends a servant, a nameless man, a man who, interestingly, carries an enormous mission, yet never draws attention to himself. He prays before he acts. He asks God for direction before taking a single step. He does not speak about himself. Everything he does points to someone else, to Abraham's son. If you pay attention, the structure of the story is almost unusual. The servant leaves with gifts that are not his. He speaks about an heir who is not present. He invites someone to join a promise that cannot yet be seen. When he finally meets Rebecca, he does not impress her with his own importance. He simply explains the mission. There is a son, there is a promise, there is a future, and he was sent to ask something simple. Are you willing to go? Rebecca could have refused. She could have asked for more proof, more time, more guarantees, but her response is surprisingly direct. She says only, "I will go," and then something extraordinary happens. The servant completes his mission. He brings the bride to the son and disappears from the story, without recognition, without glory, without even leaving his name recorded in the text. For centuries, attentive readers have sensed that something deeper is happening here, because the pattern feels familiar. A faithful messenger, a quiet mission, an invitation to participate in a promise. C.S. Lewis wrote something that fits this moment perfectly. True humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less. This servant embodies exactly that. He does not seek attention. He seeks to fulfill the mission. And many scholars have noticed something fascinating. The servant in Genesis 24 strongly resembles the way the Holy Spirit works. He does not exalt himself. He points to the Son. He carries gifts that belong to another. He invites hearts to respond to the call. And when someone finally says yes, his joy is complete. Centuries later, Jesus described something similar. In the Gospel of John, he said the Spirit would not speak of himself, but would glorify the Son, just like the servant, quiet, faithful, focused. Maybe that explains something curious about the way God works in people's lives. Many of the deepest works of God are almost invisible. They happen in silence, without spectacle, without applause. Maybe you have experienced something like that before. A moment when something changed inside you. A decision you did not expect. A new direction appearing when you least anticipated it. And only much later you realized God had been working behind the scenes the whole time. But the story does not end there, because there is another moment in Scripture when something seemingly small reveals an enormous truth. A woman is dragged before a crowd, accused, humiliated, condemned, and in the middle of that tense moment, Jesus does something strange. He bends down and begins writing on the ground with his finger, a simple detail. But when you connect it with the Old Testament, the scene transforms completely. And that is what we are about to discover now. Imagine the scene. A crowded square filled with shouting people and religious leaders burning with indignation. In the middle of the crowd, a woman is violently pushed forward. She has been caught in adultery. The accusation is public, humiliating, and without defense. The religious leaders are not there only for justice. They are setting a trap. They turn to Jesus and say, "In the law of Moses, women like this must be stoned. And you, what do you say?" It is a perfect trap. If Jesus says to stone her, he contradicts his entire message of mercy. If he says to spare her, he can be accused of rejecting the law of Moses. For a moment, the crowd holds its breath. Everyone waits for the answer. But Jesus does something unexpected. He does not respond immediately. He bends down and begins to write on the ground with his finger. It is a small detail but full of meaning. The Gospel does not tell us what he wrote. For centuries, scholars have tried to guess. Some believe Jesus wrote the sins of the accusers. Others imagined he wrote verses from the law. But perhaps the point is not the content. Perhaps the point is the gesture. Because for anyone who knew the Old Testament, that image should have sounded very familiar. There is a moment in biblical history when something very specific happens. God writes something with his own finger. This happens when the 10 Commandments are given to Moses. In the book of Exodus, we are told that the law was written by the finger of God on tablets of stone. Now think about the scene again. The religious leaders are there using the law of Moses as a weapon. They quote the scriptures to condemn. They demand that Jesus take a position. And then Jesus responds in the most silent and most powerful way possible. He does something that, in the scriptures, only God had done before. He writes with his finger, without raising his voice, without giving a speech. The message is subtle, but devastating. The one who is being judged by the law is the same one who wrote it. C.S. Lewis once said, "Christ did not come merely to teach morality. He came to redefine the very meaning of justice." That is exactly what happens. Jesus finally stands up and says only one sentence, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone." Silence. One stone falls to the ground, then another, one by one. The accusers leave, starting with the oldest. When the square finally empties, only Jesus and the woman remain. Jesus asks, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She answers, almost whispering, "No one, Lord." And then Jesus says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Jesus does not ignore sin, but he also does not allow condemnation to be the final word. Justice and mercy meet. And when we look back in biblical history, we realize that this meeting was announced from the very beginning, because there is a symbol that appears right after the fall of humanity. A symbol, small, painful, and persistent: thorns. They appear for the first time in the Garden of Eden. After the sin of Adam and Eve, God says that the earth will now produce thorns and thistles. Thorns become the sign of a broken world. Every farmer knows this. He tried to cultivate something good, and thorns appear. He tried to build something, and you encounter resistance. In relationships, in work, and in emotions, thorns are part of the human experience. They remind us that something went wrong in the story of the world. But then, centuries later, Roman soldiers take thorny branches, They weave them into a crown and place it on Jesus' head. They think they are mocking a false king, but without realizing it, they are acting out something much greater. The curse of Eden is being placed upon the one who came to redeem the world. The thorns from the fall now press against the Redeemer. C.S. Lewis wrote, "The Son of God became man to enable men to become sons of God." Christ entered into the pain of humanity. After the cross comes the wilderness, and in the wilderness something even more impressive happens. Jesus relives the entire story of Israel, but this time without failing. And that is exactly what we are going to explore now, right after the baptism of Jesus, when the voice from heaven declares, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Something surprising happens. The Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness for 40 days, without food, without company, and without distractions. Now, if you know the biblical story well, that number should sound familiar, because the people of Israel also spent 40 years in the wilderness, and it was there that their story revealed something deep about the human heart. In the wilderness, Israel complained when they were hungry, panicked when they are thirsty, and built a golden calf when Moses took too long to return. The wilderness revealed fear, distrust, and a constant tendency to doubt the goodness of God. Now look at Jesus. The scenario is the same: hunger, loneliness, and temptation. But this time something changed. Satan appears and offers 3 temptations. First he says, "If you are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread." It sounds reasonable. Jesus is starving. Jesus quotes Deuteronomy, a text that specifically recalls Israel's failures in the wilderness. "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." Where Israel complained, Jesus trusted. Satan takes Jesus to the top of the temple and says, "Throw yourself down from here. The angels will save you." In other words, force God to prove that he is with you. But again Jesus answers by quoting the scriptures, "You shall not test the Lord your God." Israel had done exactly that in wilderness. Israel asked, "Is God really among us?" Jesus refuses to repeat the mistake. The third temptation is the most direct. Satan offers all the kingdoms of the world in exchange for worship. A shortcut to power, without a cross, without suffering, and without sacrifice. But Jesus responds firmly, "Worship the Lord your God, and serve him only." At that moment something remarkable becomes clear. Jesus is rewriting the story of Israel. The same wilderness and the same temptations, but this time, without failing. C.S. Lewis wrote something deeply connected to this idea. The Son of God became man so that man might become what he was created to be. Jesus is living the life Israel should have lived, the life we should have lived, and that victory changes the way we see our own battles. The biblical story does not stop. There is a symbol that appears repeatedly in the scriptures and represents something paradoxical: death and salvation, water. Everything begins at the Red Sea. Israel is trapped. Behind them comes the Egyptian army. In front of them, only the sea, with no exit and no hope. Then God does the impossible. The sea opens, the waters rise like walls, and the people cross on dry ground. But when the enemy army tries to follow the same path, the waters returns. What saved Israel destroyed their oppressors. Centuries later, the Apostle Paul looks at event and makes a surprising connection. He says that crossing was like a baptism, passing through the waters and coming out on the other side free. This pattern appears several times in the scripture. In the flood, humanity passes through the judgment and a new creation emerges. In Christian baptism, someone enters the waters, symbolizing death, and comes out representing a new life. And then Jesus appears doing something that changes everything. On a dark night, the disciples are struggling against a storm on the sea. The wind is strong, the waves are violent, and they are exhausted. Suddenly, they see a figure walking on the water, not swimming, not fighting against the sea, but walking on it. In the ancient mindset, the sea represented chaos, forces that no one could control. But Jesus steps on the chaos as if it was solid ground. When the disciples are frightened, he says something simple: "Take courage. It is I, do not be afraid." In Greek, the words used are ego eimi, literally, I am. The same expression that God used when he revealed himself to Moses in the burning bush. Suddenly, the question of the disciples echoes in the mind of any attentive reader. Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? The answer had already been revealed from the beginning. But there is still another impressive pattern in biblical history, a moment when humanity tried to reach God on its own, and the result was chaos. That place became known as Babel, And what happened there prepares the ground for one of the most extraordinary turning points in the entire Bible. But that is exactly what we are about to discover next. At the beginning of the biblical story, there is a strange and deeply revealing episode. After the flood, humanity gathers again. Everyone speaks the same language and everyone shares the same project. They say to one another, "Let us build a city and a tower whose top reaches the heavens." At first glance it seems like simple ambition, but the real motivation appears immediately afterward. They say, "This way we will make a name for ourselves." That sentence reveals everything. The Tower of Babel was not just architecture, it was spiritual independence. It was humanity saying, "We do not need God to reach heaven." But the result is the opposite of what they expected. God confuses their languages. Suddenly, no one understands each other anymore. The construction stops. People scatter. Human unity fragments into cultures, nations, and languages. Babel becomes a monument to humanity's attempt to rise to God without God. Centuries pass, nations multiply, and languages divide. The world becomes a mosaic of cultures, often unable to understand each other. But then something extraordinary happens. In Jerusalem, during the Feast of Pentecost, a group of disciples is gathered. They are waiting, just as Jesus had instructed them. Suddenly, a sound like a powerful wind fills the house. Tongues of fire appear over each of them, and something impossible begins to happen. They begin to speak in different languages. People from many nations who are in the city hear the message, and each of them hears it in their own language. Each person understands perfectly what happened. The story of Babel is being reversed. At Babel, humanity tried to rise and ended in confusion. At Pentecost, God comes down and creates understanding. At Babel, a single language became many as judgment. At Pentecost, many languages are used as grace. C.S. Lewis wrote, "God did not come to abolish humanity. He came to redeem it." Pentecost does not eliminate cultures. It does not erase languages. God allows each nation, each language, each people to worship God in their own voice. The gospel does not destroy diversity, it redeems it. And when we begin to observe this pattern throughout the Bible, something remarkable emerges. From the beginning, God is making space for unexpected people. Rahab, a foreign prostitute, enters the story of Israel. A poor widow in Zarephath experiences miracles that not even many Israelites witnessed. A Syrophoenician woman, considered an outsider, receives the deliverance of her daughter. The biblical story constantly reveals a God who crosses borders, a God who calls the unlikely, a God who transforms outsiders into a central part of the story. And this brings us to one of the most intense moments of Jesus' ministry, when Jesus enters the temple and overturns the tables. At first glance, it seems like simple indignation, but the reason is deeper. The temple had an area called the Court of the Gentiles. It was the only space where foreigners could pray. But that place had been transformed into a noisy market, business taking place. The only place where the nations could seek God had been taken. Then Jesus quotes the prophet Isaiah, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations." Do you see the connection? Since Abraham, since Rahab, since the Exodus, and since Babel, the story had always been pointing to this. God was not building only a religion, He was preparing a global people gathered, not by language, culture, or territory, but by faith. The Bible is not just a collection of stories. It is one single story, with 66 books pointing to the same center, Jesus Christ. When you begin to notice these patterns, something changes in the way you read the scriptures. You no longer read looking only for moral lessons. You begin to look for connections. The next time you open the Bible, choose a passage you think you already know well and ask one single question: what does this reveal about Jesus? Because then the Bible stops being just an ancient book. It becomes a living story, a story that continues in your own life. Which of these biblical connections surprised you the most today? Write it down below. And if this kind of content helps you see the Bible with more depth, like the video and subscribe to C.S. Lewis Mastery channel, because the more carefully you read the scriptures, the more clearly you begin to see. See you in the next video.